I do want to be recorded for history's purposes. Iran will immediately use the money that it's receiving in sanctions relief to begin to build up its conventional capabilities. It will establish the most dominant military power in the region outside of the United States, but they will target us. And then at some point in the near future, when the time is right, they will build a nuclear weapon. And they will do so because at that point they will know that they have become immune. And then they become an established nuclear weapons power. History will condemn us for not doing what needed to be done at this critical moment in the world's history.
Back when Obama and the Democrats were celebrating the Iran deal like it was some historic breakthrough, Marco Rubio stood on the Senate floor and warned exactly where it could lead. Democrats mocked these warnings at the time. But looking at the chaos in the Middle East today, Rubio's speech hits very differently now.
And I don't like to make these issues of national security partisan, because it's important that our country be united in moments like this. But we cannot ignore that the flawed foreign policy of the last few years has brought us to this stage. Because we have a president who believed, but by the sheer force of his personality, he would be able to shape global events. We have a president that believed that by going around the world and giving key speeches in key places, he could shape the behavior of other nations and other people. We do not have the luxury of seeing the world the way we hope it would be. We have to see the world the way it is. Iran will immediately use the money that it's receiving in sanctions relief to begin to build up its conventional capabilities. It will establish the most dominant military power in the region outside of the United States, and it will raise the price of us operating in the region. They're going to build anti-access capabilities, rockets capable of destroying our aircraft carriers and ships. Continue to build these swift boats that are able to come on us, these fast boats that are able to swarm our naval assets. And they'll make it harder and harder for U.S. troops to be in the region. They'll also work with other terrorist groups in the region to target American servicemen and women. And they may or may not deny that they're involved, but they will target us and raise the price of our presence in the Middle East until they hope to completely pull us out of that region. They'll also continue to build long-range missiles, missiles capable of reaching the United States. Those are not affected by this deal, and they'll continue to build them as they've been doing. And then at some point in the near future, when the time is right, they will build a nuclear weapon. And they will do so because at that point they will know that they have become immune, that we will no longer be able to strike their nuclear program because the price of doing so will be too high. This is not just a work of imagination. It exists in the world today. It's called North Korea, where a lunatic possesses dozens of nuclear weapons and a long-range rocket that can already reach the United States. And we cannot do anything about it. An attack on North Korea today would result in an attack on Tokyo, or Seoul, or Guam, or Hawaii, or California. And so the world must now live with a lunatic in possession of nuclear weapons. And this is the goal Iran has as well, to reach a point where they become immune to any sort of credible military threat because the price of a military strike would be too high. And then they become an established nuclear weapons power. And never in the history of the world has such a regime ever possessed weapons so capable of destruction. Iran is led by a supreme leader who is a radical Shia cleric with an apocalyptic vision of the future. He is not a traditional geopolitical actor who makes decisions on the basis of borders or simply history or because of ambitions. He has an religious apocalyptic vision of the future, one that calls for triggering a conflict between the non-Muslim world and the Muslim world, one that he feels especially obligated to trigger. And he's going to possess nuclear weapons. This is the world that we are on the verge of leaving our children to inherit. And perhaps we ourselves will have to share in it. And so I want to be recorded for history's purposes, if nothing else, to say that those of us who opposed this deal understood where it would lead. And we are making a terrible mistake. And I fear that a passage of this deal will make it even harder for us to prevent it. And I hope that there is still time to change our minds. But here's the good news. Iran may have a supreme leader, but America does not. In this nation, we have a republic, and soon we will have new leaders, perhaps in this chamber, but also in the executive branch. And I pray that on their first day in office, they will reverse this deal and reimpose the sanctions and back them up with a credible threat of military force, or history will condemn us for not doing what needed to be done at this critical moment in the world's history.
Prior to this speech, then-Senator Marco Rubio also delivered remarks on the floor of the U.S. Senate, urging passage of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015.
I wanted to come to the floor today to speak about the risk that Iran poses to the world and, as a result, the legislation that's before the Senate at this moment. A lot's been talked about in the media over the last months, years, quite frankly, about the notion that we're going to work out a deal with Iran that will prevent war. Sadly, I believe that the direction this deal is headed almost guarantees war. At some point, certainly in our lifetime, but maybe before the end of the decade. Let me back up and first describe what the issue is at hand. The issue at hand is that Iran, run by a radical Shia cleric, its government, I should say, its people, perhaps don't partake in this thought process, but its government, whose head and supreme decision maker is a radical Shia cleric, has made two decisions. The first is they feel it is their obligation to export their Islamic revolution everywhere in the world, and of course it begins with the Middle East. And two, they've decided they want to become the hegemonic power in the region. They want to become the dominant nation, the dominant movement in the Middle East and in that entire region. So how do you achieve that? Well, first it requires you to drive the Americans out of the area, which is why we've seen them invest in all sorts of asymmetrical capabilities like these little small swarm boats that they use to sometimes harass U.S. naval vessels. That's why you see them just a week ago basically hijack a commercial vessel on the international waters. The second thing they do is they sponsor terrorism. They have all these proxy groups in all these countries in the region that are doing their bidding. That's also asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical meaning it's not frontal, it's using some non-traditional method to expand their power or to show their power. So they use these proxy groups like Hezbollah, or now with the group, the Houthis, that they're involved with in Yemen and in other parts of the world. And the threat is that if you attack Iran, these terrorist groups will attack you. And in fact, we have seen the hand of the Iranian government in terrorist attacks. For example, we saw an attempt to assassinate the ambassador of Saudi Arabia here in Washington, D.C. We know that in 1994 there was a bombing in Buenos Aires that was linked to Iran. So they sponsor terrorism. But the third aspect of their desire to become the hegemonic regional power is a nuclear weapon. What do you need to acquire a nuclear weapon? You need three things. The first thing you need is a bomb design. And the truth is you can buy a bomb design. The second thing you need is a delivery system, an ability to deliver the weapon, whether it's on an airplane or on a missile. And that is why Iran is developing long-range rockets. They're expending a lot of money, despite all the sanctions that are on them, they're expending a lot of money to build these long-range rockets. That isn't for some sort of fancy fireworks show. It isn't to put a man on the moon. They're building these long-range rockets because they understand that is the second critical component of a nuclear weapons program. And the third thing is you have to be able to get your hands on enriched uranium or reprocessed plutonium. And no one in the world is going to import to them weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. So they've decided to build the infrastructure to do it themselves. And they do it the way North Korea did it. They do it the way other nations have done it when they try to hide their program. They do it by claiming that they have a peaceful nuclear program that they're trying to build. In essence, their argument is, we don't want to build a weapon. We're just trying to build nuclear reactors so we can provide electricity. It makes no sense for two reasons. The first is this is an oil-rich country. They don't really need nuclear energy in order to provide cost-effective energy for their country. But the other is, it costs so much money to build the equipment to enrich and reprocess. They could just buy it, already reprocessed or enriched, and ship it. Bring it into the country the way South Korea does, the way other nations do. So if it would be cheaper to bring these things in by simply importing it, as opposed to having to spend all this money enriching and reprocessing themselves, why are they spending all this money on the infrastructure? And the answer is, because at some point in the future, they know they're going to want a nuclear weapon. Now, perhaps they haven't made the decision they need it today or next week or next year. But they certainly, at a minimum, want to have the option to be a threshold nuclear power. And I believe, knowing everything we know about them, both open source and classified, that whether they've decided or not to build a nuclear weapon, they will decide to build a nuclear weapon. Because it provides for them the sort of regime stability they crave. The radical Shia cleric that heads that country, he looks at North Korea and he looks at Libya. And he says, Libya is what happens when you don't have a nuclear capability. North Korea is what happens when you do. Muammar Gaddafi is dead and out of power. But North Korea is still run by that madman. Why? Because he has a nuclear weapon. You can't invade him or touch him because of what he'll do in response. And I think they're guided by that principle. They're guided by the principle that they want to be the regional hegemonic power, and nuclear weapons gives them that role. And they're guided by a third, equally sinister motivation, and that is the open and repeatedly stated desire to destroy the state of Israel, to wipe it off the face of the earth.
Watch this. If you go back and listen to what Marco Rubio was saying during the Obama-Iran deal debate, it honestly sounds less like a political speech and more like a warning that Washington refused to take seriously. And what makes this clip powerful today is that Rubio wasn't talking about some small policy disagreement. He was arguing that the Obama administration and Democrats were fundamentally misreading the Iranian regime itself. That was always the core issue here. The Obama White House treated Iran like it was just another country you could negotiate with if you offered enough incentives, enough sanctions relief, enough diplomatic concessions. Rubio was arguing the exact opposite. He was saying this regime wasn't driven by normal geopolitical calculations the way Western leaders wanted to believe. He warned they had ideological ambitions, regional ambitions, and long-term military goals that were never going to disappear because of signatures on a piece of paper. And remember the atmosphere at the time. The media framed anyone opposing the deal as a warmonger. Democrats kept repeating that the only alternative to the Iran deal was war. Rubio completely flipped that argument around. He said this deal itself could eventually guarantee conflict, because it would allow Iran to grow richer, stronger, and more protected while continuing to expand its military capabilities across the region. Look at the specific things he warned about in this clip. He talked about Iran building anti-access weapons designed to threaten U.S. aircraft carriers and naval operations. He talked about Iran funding terrorist proxies throughout the Middle East. He talked about long-range missile development continuing untouched by the deal. He talked about the regime trying to drive America out of the region entirely. At the time, Democrats and much of the press treated those concerns like exaggerated Republican fearmongering. But fast forward years later, and what do we see? Iranian-backed militias operating across Iraq and Syria. Hezbollah more entrenched than ever. The Houthis threatening international shipping lanes. American troops repeatedly targeted by Iran-backed groups. Massive missile and drone programs continuing to expand. The exact regional aggression Rubio warned about never stopped. In many ways, critics would argue it intensified, and this is why the clip still resonates today with conservatives. Rubio was making a broader point about weakness in American foreign policy under Obama. Republicans argued that the administration was so desperate for a diplomatic legacy that it ignored the reality of who the Iranian regime actually was. They believed Obama prioritized international approval and headline-friendly diplomacy over long-term deterrence. What also stands out is how Rubio framed Iran's long game. He wasn't saying Iran was going to rush toward a nuclear weapon overnight. He argued they were playing strategically, building leverage slowly over time, strengthening their military position, strengthening their regional alliances, and waiting until the cost of stopping them became too dangerous for the world to accept. That's why he brought up North Korea. His argument was basically this: once a hostile regime crosses a certain threshold militarily, especially with nuclear capabilities, the world becomes trapped. And honestly, that comparison terrified a lot of people at the time, because Rubio's point was that North Korea showed exactly how difficult it becomes to reverse course once a regime achieves credible nuclear deterrence. Suddenly, every military option risks catastrophic retaliation. Suddenly, entire regions become vulnerable. Suddenly, America's choices become dramatically smaller than they were years earlier. That warning feels especially important now because we've spent the last decade watching geopolitical rivals test American resolve repeatedly. Conservatives often argue that weakness invites aggression. They point to Russia becoming more aggressive, China expanding its influence, Iran strengthening its proxies, and terrorist groups reorganizing across unstable regions. To many on the right, the Obama era represented a foreign policy mindset built too heavily around optimism and diplomacy, while underestimating how adversarial regimes exploit hesitation. And you can see how Rubio was trying to sound the alarm beyond just Iran itself. He was talking about the future balance of power in the Middle East. If Iran became the dominant force in the region, countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other Gulf states would respond accordingly. That could trigger regional arms races, proxy conflicts, and even more instability. Conservatives argued the Iran deal didn't calm the region down. They believed it convinced America's allies that Washington was becoming less reliable while empowering one of their biggest enemies. Another thing that stands out revisiting this clip is how direct Rubio was about ideology. Today, a lot of politicians avoid speaking in those terms because they worry about media backlash or accusations of being inflammatory. But Rubio openly argued that Iran's leadership was motivated not just by politics, but by revolutionary religious ideology. He believed that mattered because it changed how deterrence worked. His argument was essentially that Western leaders were projecting rational Western assumptions onto a regime operating under a completely different worldview. And whether someone agrees with that or not, it's impossible to deny that this was one of the defining foreign policy fights of the Obama presidency. The Iran deal became symbolic of a much larger debate about America's role in the world. Should America project strength aggressively and isolate hostile regimes through pressure and sanctions? Or should America prioritize negotiations and international agreements even with adversaries? That debate never really ended. It still shapes American politics today. What's fascinating now is how many Americans who may not have followed this issue closely at the time are going back and reevaluating it through the lens of everything that happened afterward. Foreign policy debates often sound abstract in the moment, but years later people start comparing predictions to reality. That's why old clips like this suddenly go viral again. People look back and ask who actually understood where things were heading. And Rubio's warning here was blunt. He believed the regime would take advantage of every concession, build power over time, and eventually reach a point where the cost of stopping them became almost impossible. That was his fear. Not immediate catastrophe overnight, but gradual strategic failure that America would regret later. There's also something else people forget about this era. The Obama administration sold the Iran deal not just as policy, but almost as a moral necessity. Critics were painted as reckless or dangerous. Conservatives felt like legitimate national security concerns were being dismissed because they complicated the administration's political narrative. That frustration helped fuel broader distrust toward Washington elites and establishment media outlets that many conservatives still carry today. And politically, this debate became one of the defining foreign policy divides between Republicans and Democrats over the last decade. Republicans increasingly embraced the idea that peace comes through strength, pressure, sanctions, and deterrence. Democrats under Obama leaned heavily into diplomacy, international agreements, and engagement with adversarial regimes. The Iran deal became the clearest symbol of that divide. This clip also reminds people why Rubio became such a major figure within Republican foreign policy circles. Whether people agree with him or not, he was one of the loudest voices warning about the long-term consequences of empowering hostile regimes. He framed foreign policy in stark terms, arguing that American weakness abroad eventually creates danger at home. That message resonated deeply with conservative voters who already believed the Obama administration was retreating from global leadership. And looking back now, you can understand why many conservatives feel vindicated revisiting this debate. The Middle East today is not more stable than it was before the Iran deal. Iran's regional influence certainly did not disappear. The idea that economic incentives alone would fundamentally moderate the regime looks far less convincing than Democrats promised at the time. The biggest takeaway from this clip is simple. Rubio believed America was empowering a hostile regime while pretending it was restraining it. He believed the Obama administration misunderstood the nature of the threat, underestimated Iran's ambitions, and overestimated the power of diplomacy alone. Years later, a lot of Americans are looking back at the speech wondering if he saw the danger more clearly than Washington elites wanted to admit at the time. If you made it this far, comment below. Do you think Rubio was right about the Iran deal, or do you think Obama made the correct decision at the time? And if you want more political breakdowns and throwback moments like this, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications because there's a lot more to come.